Welcome to 100 Plus, an historical overview of 100 of the most important people, events, and ideas of the last 2,000 years. This is a survey of the forces and factors that have shaped today's world, the Christian faith, and you. And in today's episode, we're going to be focusing on 19th century theologians and books, and I'm doing so with my friend David Moore. So this is a little different. It's been a long time since I've recorded a podcast. I'm embarrassed by that. I did hear that there's Apple has 2 million podcast entries, and like 1 million of them only have 1 or 2 episodes. And so this is episode 79. I'm not as embarrassed as I might be, but I'm going to spare you all the excuses. My being behind on the podcast is really about, being behind in writing and being behind in life and being a pastor and all the other things that are going on. But today we're doing something different. So we're combining books and theologians of the 19th century. I have done episodes on books. I have done episodes on theologians, haven't combined them. If you're a longtime listener, you might remember way back, episode 31, I looked at all the key books from the beginning of, civilization, because that's when writing starts, civilization up through the 14th century. And then I did another one in the 50s. I did an episode just on the key books in the 15th, 16th, 17th, and 18th centuries. So, I've done a lot of things on theologians, but have not combined them. So that's different. And the other thing that's different is that I have David on to walk me through this. So let me pause here. David has been on the other podcast that I do. You might remember that. David is the president of Two Cities Ministries, and he lives in Austin, Texas. He's the author of a handful of books, most recently Stuck in the Present, How History Frees and Forms Christians. And that we talked about that on that podcast. He's spoken in many venues around the country and around the world. He's working on a YouTube channel called More Engaging. So Moore, since you don't get to see that, More Engaging, which will feature, among other things, some of his insights from having interviewed over 200 writers, leaders, and scholars, including 3 Pulitzer Prize winners and William Buckley. I'm not certain that bringing David on the show is a good idea. I heard a talk radio guy say, you know why I let a guest on the show, or why, what the screener is looking for. And there's like a half hour where people are calling in to say, what is the assignment of the screener to let somebody in to talk on the radio program? And people are guessing all kinds of things. And finally, this talk radio host, who I won't give his name, this was like 15, 20 years ago I heard this, maybe 25 years ago. He had the golden microphone, I think is what he called it. But he said, the screener's job is to let people on the show that will make me look smart. That is the sole purpose for having anybody on. So I don't think David's going to make me look smart. I think David's going to make me look a little stupid and behind, but oh well. He is I decided to have David on to help me with this because he is such an avid reader. And I got his list of books that he had read in 2022, or maybe it was the list of books you were going to read in 23. Whatever it was a long list, and it made me depressed. And so let me just pause here, David. You can say hello, and you can tell me how many books were on that list.
Well, there's probably so what I've been doing for the last decade plus is I keep track of all my reading, and typically, because Mike, and you might want to ask me about this more, but because of my process, the way I engage books with my highlighting marginality, I read probably between 50 to 60 in any given year. That's basically the range. I always tell people when they say, well, it's a lot, I say, well, I could read more if I didn't take so many notes. But anyway, that list that you got was new in the sense that I've never done a list projecting into the future. So that list is what I want to read from, I turned 65 here in a little bit. So my list from 65 to 70 of about 50 to 60 per year. So it's probably like 250, 300 books on there that kind of give me the boundaries of where I want to stay. I think it's very easy without a plan just to kind of be responding to trends and faddish books. And I've read a number of that stuff to kind of go, you look at your library sometimes, you kind of go, that book was such a waste. Why did I read that thing? I could have read so much better. So that was basically a book, a mortality list, if you want to kind of hem me.
Bucket list. You can just call it your bucket. Some people want to go skydiving. They want
there
to
you go.
I don't know, to Morocco. You want to read.
Yeah. So that's kind of the ballpark of I'd like to read those books or reread, as you meant, as I mentioned on that list several times. I do reread the better books. So those books, hopefully between 65 and 69, 70 will be mainly the books.
And just for a second, I mean, I've got a pretty extensive process of marking up a book and then filing it and all of that. So that's less interesting to me than the categories of the books that you have decided you need to be reading. What are the categories of books?
Well, the categories, I think there's like 8 or 10 of them. Certainly biblical, theological, there's history, and then history divided by different eras from ancient to the modern to make sure there's some balance in there. There's some on art and architecture, which I don't know a whole lot about. That's the reason why it's there. There's some on music. There's some on philosophy. I've read a little bit of philosophy, but in compared to theology, not very much. There's some on spiritual life. I think there's a couple other categories I'm leaving out. I'm trying to think. Oh, there's some stuff on science. If it's all of God's world, I mean, I'm fairly illiterate, quite illiterate when it comes to scientific stuff. So I dug around and picked maybe 6, 8, I thought accessible, but good books that maybe teach me a little bit about physics or the natural world. So those are on there as well.
And how about
literature? I left out literature.
How about fiction? Is that a category that you're reading in?
Yeah, the last one I mentioned, literature is on there too. I left that out.
Okay.
And
I missed that. Okay.
Yeah. So
so
go ahead.
Is it fair to say, I mean, when I think of you, I know you've taught a class on Pilgrim's Progress, and that doesn't fit into our historical focus for today, but is that the book you have outside of the Bible that you've read the most often, do you think?
Yeah, there's several, there's books like Confessions that I've probably read 3, 4 times, but I think I've kept track. I think I'm on my 6th read of the Pilgrim's Progress, which may sound impressive, but Spurgeon read it 100 times, and he had a library of 12,000. And the one thing about that, Mike, I would say is that, and I've noticed this, and undoubtedly you have too, that books that you reread, you start seeing things that you missed the first time because there's so much going on. My wife loves David Copperfield. Dickens said it was his favorite book that he wrote. I've not read it. I've read Great Expectations, but I've wanted to read David Copperfield. And she read it years ago, and then she reread it recently, and it's like 900 pages, and saw a bunch of new stuff, connections, and all that. I think Packer, and you might know about this, I think Packer read Pilgrim's Progress and Brothers Karamazov every year for the last 50 years of his life. So that's another example of, and he spoke, he like me said probably his 2 favorite Puritans, and I read a lot of Puritan devotional literature, were Richard Baxter and John Bunyan. And that would certainly be the case with me. Bunyan's book, it classically repays so many rereads. There's just so much going on there. I mean, I could talk a lot about that.
So I have read the Brothers K twice, and that was painful.
Yeah.
I can't imagine I'm going to do it a 3rd time. But I was going to ask you, so I think 15 years ago, when I heard that you had named this ministry two cities, that I asked, is this Augustine or is this a tale of two cities, best of times, worst of times? And I can't remember what your answer was, but I'm guessing it's Augustine.
It is Augustine. I was on a flight one time where a guy thought it was Minneapolis, St. Paul.
Yeah, well, okay, there is that. Yeah, I wasn't thinking living in Austin that you had named your ministry after Minneapolis and St. Paul.
It is City of God. It is Augustine. Confessions has probably had a bigger impact on me in a lot of ways, but a City of God has as well. I spent a year, along with all my other reading, just slowly working myself through that book. It's remarkable for a bunch of reasons. One I'll say that may be of interest to your listeners is that he and Aquinas did the same thing in Summa Contra Gentiles, is that they knew the alternative story better than most of the proponents of that story. So Augustine knew the story of atheism, skepticism, so-called, better than a lot of the people did, and who held that view, just like Aquinas knew Islam better than a lot of Muslims did. So they were able to, in a sense, as Curtis Chang has said in his terrific book, Engaging Unbelief, go into the alternative story, understand it implicitly, and then help people incrementally move to see that the incarnation was what they were really longing for, but could move them ever so slightly to it. So it's, two loves, City of God, City of Man. Yeah, the ministry is based on that. And in a sense, it's based on Matthew 10 about being shrewd as a serpent, innocent as a dove. That's kind of the City of God, City of Man motif as well. But yeah.
Okay, well, so I'm out of practice here. I don't remember what time we started, so I'm trying to watch when we've got to end. I do know I ought to move us along.
Yeah.
I think we talked last week when we were setting this up about Mary Eberstadt's book, Loser Letters. Just when you mentioned just this whole idea that Curtis Chang has just mentioned. I'm not familiar with that book, but the idea that great authors, some of these great authors, they understand the world of other people very well, and they can help people see the faults in that. I obviously was part of Francis Schaeffer's apologetic, but in this book by Eberstadt, sort of a Screw Tape Letters spoof by A.F. Christian, a former Christian. So a former A.F. Christian writing to Hitchens and Dawkins and Sam Harris as a new atheist and asking all these questions and trying to figure things out. And in the process, sort of undermining atheism. It's very clever. But that is far afield from our topic. We are focusing on the 18th or the 19th century. Before we go there, talk for 2 minutes about why you think people ought to read.
Oh, goodness. Well, I think there's, Tim Keller's asked that question a lot, he says that's always the easiest question to answer because in one word, it's desperation. And I very much echo that sentiment that the world's terrifically complex. I think the older you get, if you're honest with yourself, speaking truth to yourself, as the psalmist talks about, and the more you hopefully have your head out of the proverbial sand and looking about you and looking around you, looking back, looking forward, you can't help but go, I need as much help as I possibly can get. And great books do that. I think travel does that. And I think relationships with friends who don't necessarily mimic and agree with everything you say, I think those three are really, really powerful in advancing the ball to some degree as far as clarity and confidence about where the truth resides. And I'll come back to books in a minute, but so in that regard, as far as multiple perspectives, when we had cable TV, I watched all three, MSNBC, CNN, and Fox, and go back and forth, every 5 or 10 minutes. And in my mind, try to think, okay, where is the Venn diagram where they all agree this event happened and this is kind of how it happened. And, sometimes the shading would be pretty narrow, but
Yeah.
that gave me great confidence along with listening to NPR and all the way to Rush Limbaugh when he was on to say, okay, everyone's kind of in agreement. This is kind of what happened and this is why. That's probably where the truth is to be found. I think the same way with great books that, Lewis's great essay, which well, of the reading of old books, that the books from a different era, and we're talking about the 19th century, as Lewis said, they committed their own errors, but they didn't commit your errors. And so
Right.
you need them to be a check on your errors. So like when you read a book, say about medieval England, and you see before a meal, they spend protracted time in prayer, thanking God for a basic loaf of bread and some common wine, you should feel kind of like
Right.
rebuked.
Pretty fortunate.
I just rush through my fast food, et cetera. So I think the desperation, the conversation partners, one of my favorite books, I know it's outside the timeline we're talking about, but Voltaire's Candide is one of my favorite books. And
Brutal.
it is brutal, but it just gets you. It's kind of like that, whether it's apocryphal or not, but that idea of like, Socrates, Plato kind of sticking the guy under the water and the guy almost,
right.
and you went
I'm
through
desperate.
Yeah, how desperate are you? I think Voltaire does that like a lot of good writers do, that to say, okay, is it really the best of all possible worlds? Really? You're seeing, as Candide is being exposed once he's kicked out of the palace and seeing all the carnage that he'd never been privy to. And, Pangloss, all tongue, his mentors saying, oh, it's the best of all possible worlds, all best possible worlds. That starts to ring hollow, not only for Candide, but toward the end of the book, as Pangloss doesn't even believe it anymore. He's going, who am I kidding? I don't believe this kind of stuff. So, that's where the famous 10-year garden and all that. So I think desperation, conversation partners, go into other times. And as Lewis, I'll invoke Lewis again, and I would recommend Experiment and Criticism as another kind of twin with that essay. I think his saying that we read to see we're not alone. And for me, Mike, as you've heard me talk about either in person or maybe in your previous podcast, I've struggled at times with intellectual doubt about the Christian faith. It gives me great encouragement to know there's brothers and sisters that have asked pretty much the same questions.
The same questions. Yep.
Struggled with the same thing, had the process wondering, where is God? God, this world is more messed up than a God supposedly is all loving and all kind. I don't get it. So books, relationships, and travel, to me, that tripod does all three of those things. So if you knock out if you have a 3-legged stool and you saw off one leg, you can maybe still kind of sit on it, but it's pretty wobbly. So I would recommend travel if you can, friends that disagree with you, and good books.
Well, I was with it was a couple years ago, but we always have 3 or 4 interns or first year out of seminary, whatever, young guys hanging out, doing some sort of, again, internship, whatever. And one of them said to me, because I was recommending some books and saying, you guys ought to read this. And one of them said to me, because I don't like to read. You keep giving us stuff to read. I don't like to read. And I remember saying, I got nothing for you. Like, I mean, how in the world are you going to speak 2 or 3 times a week for the next 40 years? I mean, the amount of stuff you have to take in to have anything to say, there is an act of desperation of saying, I've got to sort this out. I've got to be with people who are smarter than I am. I've got to hear this from a different perspective. If everybody else is thinking X, and I did the same thing with the radio. So I didn't do it with TV, but on the radio, we don't have cable TV, but I'd listen to 820 Chicago Progressive Talk and 790 the Answer, the Fox affiliate. I'd listen and I'd sort of try and balance it and listen part to one and part to the other. I did that for about 3 years. And about a year and a half ago, I said, I can't do this anymore. I can't do it. I've done it. I've, forced myself to do it. I'm done.
Yeah.
And podcasts were coming on, and I just found I'd much rather listen to somebody, guide me through a process than just sort of haphazard take up an answer. Okay, well, enough of that. Thank
Yeah.
you.
Yeah.
I want to turn us to the 19th century. So just by way of level setting the room for everybody, we come out of the 18th century, again, the 1700s. That's a big time of revolutions, the American Revolution, the French Revolution. We had the Great Awakening. We've got theologians like Edwards and Wesley and Whitefield, and you've got all the stuff that's happening there in terms of writing. I talked previously about, the Federalist Papers, and you've got Adam Smith with The Wealth of Nations, Social Contract. We talked then about Pilgrim's Progress, Robinson Crusoe. All of that brings us then out of the 18th century into the 19th century. We've got the Civil War. We've got America wrestling with slavery. We've got Europe and America going through the Industrial Revolution, the urbanization that follows that. You've got things happening in Europe that sort of conspire to see France going down, Britain climbing, the US and Russia sort of expanding. So all of that by way of saying there were a handful of prominent theologians. And David, I'm going to ask you, as I said, to go first and sort of name the key theologians, and I'm going to give you the opportunity to define theologians. There's obviously a proper classical definition of that, but then there's people that I think increasingly today get labeled theologians that I wouldn't necessarily think of as a theologian. Yeah. But sometimes I really like what these people are saying and doing, and other times I think you could use that definition and say Oprah has been one of the more prominent, quote, theologians in the last part of the 20th, early part of the 21st century. Yeah. I don't think of Oprah as a theologian, but I'm going to let you who are the key players in your mind? What do you mean by theologian, and who do you think they were in the 19th century?
So let's start with who's a theologian. Obviously technically words about God. We all speak words about God, whether we believe in them or not. So in a loose sense, everyone's a theologian. R.C. Sproul and others have made a big point about that. In a more technical sense,
the question is not whether you have thoughts about God. The question is whether your thoughts about God are any good, if they're accurate.
Yeah, well formed, yes. And then those who we'd see as in the guild, if you will, who are writing books on theology self-consciously, who have advanced degrees, then you're talking about an area where there's a fair amount of disagreement as far as how theology ought to be written. And here I'll kind of introduce, and again, I've done some writing on this and I could go into more detail, but I know sake of time, probably don't have it. But I do want to say that even in the West, there's not a monolith as far as how theology ought to be written. And certainly when you compare the East to the West, there's even bigger disagreements. And what I mean by that is that in the West, there's what Mark Noll and others call this systematizing urge, this desire to kind of codify and reduce statements to God, about God, down to certain formulas and whatnot. I know when at Trinity, where we both were at in the years I was there, Wayne Grudem was the first reader on my thesis, and he was in the midst of writing his uber popular systematic theology, which now I think is over 1 million copies. And he said to the class one day, this class I had with him, I had several with him, but this one class, he said, my doctoral supervisor at Cambridge, Charlie Moule, CFD Moule, doesn't agree with what I'm doing right now in writing the systematic theology. And he said, he's kind of looking over my shoulder and he's like disappointed. He's kind of frowning. He's not excited about it. Wayne was very open about that. I remember at the time, fairly young, thinking, what's wrong with writing a systematic theology? So the way even we conceptualize what's legitimate theology, I think there's a spectrum of how systematized it ought to be. In the East, they believe one of the biggest disasters for theology is when theology left the church and went into the university and became a separate discipline, just like other disciplines and sub-disciplines. That in the East, it's more stayed in the church, and systematic theologies really are kind of, I don't say non-existent, but they're very rare the way we think of it in
Yeah.
the West.
Well, I think that, yeah, I've sort of had a little bit of that evolution in my own thinking of realizing that God is more mysterious than the systematicians will often suggest. And secondly, it does allow you to head down that Greek way of thinking as opposed to the more Hebraic way of thinking. Knowing is knowing about as opposed to knowing and being in a relationship with God. And certainly, I'm guessing who some of your 19th century theologians will be, and some of these people you'd say, yeah, no, this is just a heady project. Yeah, a heady science project. It's a term paper. It's not a relationship. So yeah, that I think that's now. Having said all that, I'm very Western. Like I want things in categories. It really helps me to think.
Yeah.
And I'm frustrated by I'm frustrated at least until I understand that the confusion is intentional. Otherwise, I'm scrambling to go, this doesn't make sense to me. It seems like you're saying A here and not A here. And
Yeah.
What am I missing? And then some points you go, oh, that is what you're saying. Okay, well, now I'll deal with that a little bit differently. But
Yeah.
I like some of the systematic. My dad was an engineer.
Mine too. My dad as well. Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. I mean, that's I say all that because we're introducing 19th century theologians. And I think it's important to keep that in mind. You know, there's a guy that James Lanier in 1859, I believe, literally the same year that Origin of Species came out, that talked about how theology is just as scientific, just as precise as any other discipline. Mark Knoll quotes this book, and there's a bunch of other things that are happening in mid 19th century because of the scientific revolution, where you have this mushrooming of activity, scholarly and otherwise, that's showing the Christian faith is just as reasonable, just as rational. And unless someone listening goes, wait a second, there were people that were systematizing way before the 19th century, and they think about Aquinas and maybe even invoke Origen with this Exapola, where he's kind of doing the column by column and showing kind of reasonably how these things relate and fit. Sure. But I do think it's true that you see a mushrooming of it in the 19th century for a bunch of reasons. And like you, I think I benefited from them. So the ones I would pick, and you know, it's I'm cheating a little bit on one, but I don't think too much. B.B. Warfield and Charles Hodge at Princeton, and I can come back and say why I would pick those. J. Gresham Machen. I know some of these were on as we were going back and forth, some of your lists. Schleiermacher to me is a slam dunk. You know, there's just no doubt he should be on the list of formative, influential for a whole bunch of reasons.
Because of his impact, not because you like him.
Right, exactly. Yeah, impact for sure. And then the cheating, and you've already kind of given me a little bit of wiggle room on this, so I really appreciate it. Is I would probably put Dostoevsky in there. I know he could fit under literature or theology, but I think because the actual things that come out of Father Zosima's, the Orthodox priest in that book, out of his mouth about the character of God with struggling Christians, are some really profound thoughts that I think help us think well about who God is. So I add that. That's my fifth. So a lot more could be added. And again, I'm not necessarily a big fan of some of those that I listed, but I think that's a decent list for influential people in the 19th century.
Yep. So we did, all, full transparency here to the to the reader a few weeks ago, I asked you to send me your list. You sent me one name. I wanted to go, come on, more. One name is not a list. And then 5 minutes before we went live here, I asked to see your list.
Yeah.
But we had a lot of overlap. So I also had, under the people that I thought I needed to list just because of their influence, I had Schleiermacher. And again, I gave a whole podcast over to theological liberalism. I'll just remind people that when somebody says liberal, you've learned nothing about what they're talking about. You got to ask, so are they a theological liberal in the theological liberal sense with a capital L liberal? It's a movement, and it was shaped by higher criticism and science and all of these movements, and it was very much a movement to the left. But then you also have liberalism being used in the classic sense, which is exploring freedom, and you've got all this. I mean, today many political conservatives are actually classic liberals, and then you've got the word liberal being used to refer to people who are progressive or on the left. So Schleiermacher was a theological liberal and sort of the father of theological liberalism. So I gave a whole lecture on him. I also put down John Nelson Darby. I thought about Schofield, and I actually jotted down Schofield because I just thought, okay, in the United States, the influence of dispensationalism has been significant.
Yeah.
But Schofield was more 20th century, and so I went back to Darby, and that's the whole premillennialism, pre-tribulation rapture, left behind stuff. So that's his influence. And then I also put down John Henry Newman, who, just as I was looking for a Roman Catholic, and in the 19th century, I couldn't immediately name a pope. And Newman was such an influential writer, thinker, historian, philosopher, all of that. My favorite, the guy that I wrote down as my favorite theologian for the 19th century would be Kuyper.
Mm-hmm.
And, Kuyper was several things. He starts the Free University in Amsterdam, or he's involved in the organizing of that. He's the prime minister of the Netherlands. He's the editor of a major newspaper, and he writes all these theological books. And I don't know, good grief. I mean, if you want to feel bad about yourself, read about Kuyper. But Kuyper, very reformed. And the famous quote that I parrot from Kuyper is, "There's not a single solitary inch anywhere in the universe around which Jesus doesn't say mine," right? That the idea that Jesus needs to be Lord, not just of the church, but Lord of the classroom and the courtroom and the boardroom and, everything. We've got to think biblically and rightly about all these things. So I like Kuyper. I also put down B.B. Warfield, one of the great Princeton thinkers, president, and I had Machen. And then I put Dostoevsky, and I also put Abraham Lincoln. So I thought,
okay. Well, we got that share too. That I would throw him in as well. I think again, there's so many, and when I sent you the one, I didn't know if you wanted all the other ones then, and it was just a communication thing. But
you were sandbagging. I was looking to do some of the work for me, and you wouldn't do it. So
I will mention two books because you allude to these things. Roger Olson's recent little book called Against Liberalism is a great, clear exposition of liberal theology. It's a great historical theologian. And then Scott McKnight's forthcoming book, Revelation for the Rest of Us, which I recently reviewed, is terrific. And I won't give it away, but you read that, and if you're a hardcore or even a somewhat softcore dispensationalist, hopefully you're going to pause and go, this seems a little bit strange.
McKnight lives close to here, and I occasionally see him. I asked yesterday, I was having lunch with Trinity, a friend who's the president of Trinity, and we were talking, and McKnight came up, and I said, how in the world does Scott McKnight write so many books and keep doing everything? He goes, he sleeps like 3 hours a night. And I go, well, that would explain a lot, because I can't even read everything the guy writes. But I saw your review on that.
Yeah, it's very good. And to his credit, as I mentioned, he's doing more and more books with other people, which he doesn't need to, but it's a very gracious way to
Let other people get out there. Yeah.
But we're talking 19th century, Mike. And so this makes a significant, I think, hook for how history is helpful back to your reading and now 19th century theology. For me, I went to Dallas Seminary before I went to Trinity. And when I started really thinking about, like, okay, dispensationalism, I know premillennialism, Justin Martyr and others kind of saw it in seed form, but dispensationalism as a system of theology emerges in early 19th century Scotland, Derby, etc. And I just thought, so no one's seen dispensationalism for 1800 plus years. And the story you hear at Dallas, and I've got some dear friends that teach there, are, well, progress in doctrine, and just like eschatology, end times is the end of a systematic theology in a sense. Chronologically, that's kind of what's happened as well as the church. And as a young Christian, I was in my 20s at Dallas. I thought, well, they're a lot more learned than me, and okay. But then when I started thinking, I thought, I don't buy it. Now, when I go to heaven and God says, oh yeah, I'm going to correct, here we have all of humanity, I'm going to correct all your theology. If he says dispensationalism is true, I'll be surprised, but not dismayed, like disappointed. But I certainly won't be surprised if he says, oh, by the way, do you hardcore dispensationalists? And I got some charts that you guys used to be excited about, the color-coded stuff. That's really not true. And here's what's really going on. Now I'm going to unfold like the history of redemption for you.
Yeah.
So the recency of it, again, 19th century, which we're talking about, and I agree with you. I think Darby is enormously influential. Again, he or Schofield would not be my pick for favorite theologians, but you talked about influence. I think you're right. They're very influential.
Okay. Well, let's pivot from people to books.
Okay.
So, however you want to frame your category, I know that obviously there's lots of different genre. So, mention some categories in your favorite books in those categories.
Okay. Well, I will say my interest in early 19th century America was really significantly catalyzed by the writings of the late Roger Lundeen, who taught at Wheaton for many years. Culture of Interpretation, which George Marsden and others have said is just a model of Christian scholarship. And in that book, laying out the Romantic movement and the influences of transcendentalism, Emerson, Thoreau, Fuller, Emily Dickinson, who was not a transcendentalist, Melville, also not a transcendentalist, but great 19th century writers, Hawthorne, Poe, Rich, American Renaissance, as it's been called. So my interest was really spawned years ago by Culture of Interpretation. I interviewed Roger on that book when I was doing radio, read a number of his books since then, all incredible books. The other books I would mention maybe as recommendations, kind of for contextualizing what I'm about to say. One would be Democratization of American Christianity by Nathan Hatch, where he shows that the influence of Jacksonian America is not just in the circumscribed so-called political arena, but democratization affects everything, including the church. That's really significant, I think, for understanding 19th century, certainly American context. And then Anti-Intellectualism in American Life, Richard Hofstadter's Pulitzer Prize winning book. And then I would add, I think you can't escape the enormous influence of a guy who's an age is, listed after him, the Jacksonian age. I think a good biography on Jackson is really critical, at least in the American context, to understanding it. And I've read several biographies, on him, but two that I think are really quite good are John William Ward's book, Andrew Jackson's Symbol for an Age, published by Oxford, short, but kind of gives you an idea that he symbolizes a whole age. That's the name. And John Meacham's book, American Lion. So,
Okay. So let me just jump in here and say you've done something interesting that I did not foresee, and that is that you're mentioning a bunch of 20th and 21st century writers writing about the 19th century and explaining it. So Meacham and Hatch and Lundeen and others. And I've not read most of those. I've read some of those, but is there a 19th century? Are there some 19th century books that you are most excited about?
Yes. I mean,
Okay.
these would be, so my list, and you can come back and I actually I would love to read just a little bit of poetry, but not much.
Okay.
Kind of depicts the age and my interest, and I think what's going on in certainly American context. So mine, and again, there's a lot I could list here, but I put down Emily Dickinson's poetry, Ralph Waldo Emerson's essays, Nathaniel Hawthorne's Scarlet Letter, which a lot of people, even in Europe, said was finally we got Americans that can write. This is great literature. American literature was mocked kind of pretty much before that. Writings, essays, addresses of Lincoln. You've mentioned him. Thoreau, many times mispronounced Thoreau, but it's Thoreau. His Walden is huge. And I'd say you got to have Narrative of a Slave by Frederick Douglass in there, at least in the American context. So that would be a smattering. And like I said, I'd love to read just a snippet of Dickinson, but whenever you want to go there. So that'd be a handful of all home run books or collections.
Well, we will end with your reading of Dickinson.
Okay,
so
good.
I was guessing you were going to do something with Emerson.
Okay.
Yeah, not surprised. Walden, I was talking with somebody who was moving further north and was packing food as if they might be snowbound for 2 months. And it sounds like you gotta read a little bit of Walden here. That I'm not sure whether you're gonna. I asked her if she had. She said, not since 8th grade. And I go, well, we might have some time to do that. Lincoln, of course. Again, I put him as a theologian. His second inaugural address, great, profound work. It's been a long time since I read Hawthorne's Scarlet Letter. Frederick Douglass, that's interesting. I have missed that. I had down Spurgeon's sermons. I put down In His Steps, which I read and didn't love, but I was sort of skimming lists of the premier books for, to sort of have my memory jarred. And I was reading a little bit of that. I thought, okay, here's the WWJD bracelet of the 19th century. I had no idea 50 million copies of that book went out.
In His Steps,
when I was a college pastor, there was a period where everybody was, for whatever reason, was reading that again. And I was, sort of pushing back and saying, it's not exactly the question that I think you ought to be asking, because Jesus is going to do some things that we don't do, but it's a great book. Certainly recommend it. So I had down also Uncle Tom's Cabin, which I recommend frequently. And I say, I realize there's, obviously there's a lot of people who, for a variety of reasons, the term Uncle Tom has become so pejorative that you don't know what you're going to get. But Uncle Tom is a Christ figure that brings me to tears reading about his service, and it's a great book. Les Mis is the book that I've read that a few times, and that is, I don't know, 900 pages, 1,000 pages. I love Les Mis.
I've not read it, just seen the play.
Okay, well, it's my favorite work of fiction, and
wow. Okay.
There's about a third. If you've seen the play, I mean, I think the musical is great, but about a third of the story is missing.
Wow.
So all the stuff that is going to lead to Marius. So Marius, who will marry, who will come at the end. You've got Jean Valjean saving Marius, and there's just a whole backstory there. I think it's great. And then I put down Brothers Karamazov, just as another under sort of Christian fiction. I put down two, Frankenstein and The Picture of Dorian Gray. Mary Shelley and Oscar Wilde are not Christians, but I just thought they were profound theological books that I have read and talked on. So any other books are there in the 19th century you want to mention? I'm going to ask you some 3 quick lightning round questions, and you can read some Emily Dickinson, and we'll call it a wrap.
That sounds good. I think that's a pretty good list. There's obviously, I didn't mention Moby Dick. I think I would very much include that in great books for that.
Well, I'll just say this: my roommate from college about 6 months ago writes me and he says, "Hey," or texts me, he says, "I'm reading Moby Dick. Have you read it?" And I said, "Yeah, I have." He goes, "I'm loving it." And I go, "Well, write to me in a couple weeks." I go, "There's what I remember is like 20 pages of the different kind of krill you could eat and all these different shades of white." And I go, "I would read 30 pages and go, what is going on? I'm dying here." So
no, I agree. There's definitely tedious parts. Some people think Billy Budd's better, and I have not read Billy Budd, but and it got panned when it first came out. It did not do well, and so
you're talking about Moby Dick or Billy Budd?
Moby Dick, yeah, Moby Dick. So, but
well, it's been a long time since I read Billy Budd, but my understanding is that part of the celebration of Lewis in the Chronicles with Aslan is that he pulls off a good character. Really hard to write a good character, and Billy, and that he had done a better job than was being done by Melville with Billy Budd. It's been so long since I've read Billy Budd, I couldn't tell you.
Okay. So you said lightning, or do you want me to?
I'm gonna go the lightning round here. So, I think I saw somewhere that you had a list of the first, 20 books that every Christian ought to read. I'm just asking for, what are the 5 books that you're trying to put in a new Christian's hand, or somebody that's been a Christ follower for a while, but maybe hasn't really moved down the path very far, and you're saying, here's your next 5 books that you need to read?
So I would say one that probably I recommend as much as about anything for this kind of question, because people ask, and sometimes specifically about church history. But I would say Church History in Plain Language, Bruce Shelley's overview of church history. I think it's in its 5th edition now. That I recommend all over the place. Good survey, clear, good connections, done better in each successive edition. Another one, just kind of, I'm a big believer in, you got to give people the landscape first, and then you can always get the particulars. So I think as far as the landscape, as far as thinking Christianly, either something like short, like Your Mind Matters by Stott, maybe Harry Blumere's The Christian Mind, but probably if I feel like they can handle it and have some ability to process it, The Universe Next Door by James Sire would probably be my pick recommendation to kind of give them kind of that worldview kind of thinking thing. With the Bible, again, kind of the 50,000 foot view or 30,000 foot view, whatever, reading the Bible for All It's Worth by Fee and Stewart. I think it just does a really good job of alerting young Christians, like, I need to be aware of different types of literature within Scripture. It's not just a flattened thing, and just alerts you to read, I think, more carefully. I think for warmth of heart, and this is autobiographical for me, but I know it's huge for a lot of other people. Pursuit of God by Tozer would probably be on that list. And then some kind of introduction of theology. You know, Alistair McGrath's done some, Charles Ryrie's done some, a number of people have done it, but I think there's a need just kind of for the just general, here's why theology matters, here's how it kind of works, maybe introducing some basic terms, here's how thinking theologically relates to how to think biblically. They're related, but they are distinct kind of ways of thinking and navigating the Christian life. So some kind of basic intro. Again, McGrath and others, there's a number. So those probably be, a handful that I would recommend.
Just as this is a small world conversation, but McKnight is at Northern Seminary. Do you know that Gordon Fee's daughter teaches there?
Yeah, Sheriff. Yeah, I don't know her, but yeah, I knew she was there. Yeah.
We were on staff at the same church briefly,
Okay.
in Bellingham, Washington. So, okay, 5. By the way, I had to say to everybody listening, David has gone a little bit into the deeper end of the pool than I would have expected for the first 5 books that you would read, but that'd be great. Read those books. I'm excited for that.
Maybe basic Christianity for that intro.
Yeah.
That Stott's little book is really
Yeah.
good. That was helpful. Basic.
Yep.
So, okay.
The 5 different books that you think every Christian must read. So this is just more generically, not your first, not early young Christians, but anybody.
Okay, surprise, surprise. My top 2.
Pilgrim's Progress.
Pilgrim's Progress is number 1. Confessions is 2, which I found over the years that John Newton, I've collected my list now to my delight that Samuel Johnson listed those as 2 of his favorite books. So The Pilgrim's Progress by Bunyan and Confessions for sure. And then I would say certainly, not Pride of Place, but very close. Pensées by Pascal. Something by Lewis, probably Mere Christianity, maybe Screwtape Letters. And then I would round it out with saying probably Orthodoxy, because I think Chesterton does a lot to show the imagination and humor in service of the Christian life and thinking well, which a lot of people do not do or can't do. I think Chesterton does it brilliantly. And my favorite essay, The Madmen, is in that collection of Orthodoxy. So those would be my 5.
Okay. And what are you reading now?
Well, I tend to read about 6 books at the same time. And I know that might sound crazy to some people that like to just stay in one. I do it for a number of reasons. One, if I get a bit weary with one, I can keep reading. If I'm just reading the same one and I'm weary, then all my reading stops. So that's not good. Another thing is it allows me to see the conversations cross purposes sometimes between them. And then it's really motivating. I end up checking off my list a bunch of books that I read at the same time because they get clustered. So the 6 right now are Democracy's Discontent by the political philosopher at Harvard, Michael Sandel. It's a second edition of his book. I'm rereading Fateful Lightning, Alan Gesel's big book on the Civil War, which is fabulous. I'm finishing up a book called A Clearing in the Distance, Frederick Law Olmsted and America in the 19th Century by an architectural historian named Witold Rybczynski. And because we were last summer going to both Boston and New York, and Olmsted was significant for the Boston Common, Central Park, the design of it, I wanted to know more about him. So finishing up that book. Reading with a Friend, Scripture as Real Presence, Hans Boersman's book about the early church fathers and how they interpreted Scripture. Several commentaries on John. I'll just mention David Ford's theological commentary, which is terrific. And then a book of poetry, which is kind of like an ongoing deal. So those are my 6 that I'm reading right now.
Okay. Yeah. About 6 months ago, I mentioned in a sermon that I had, 6 or 7 books, half read, lying around. And he busted me saying, "What in the world? Why did you say that?" And I was like, "Why did I say what?" He goes, "You're reading 67 books like that. That was just sheer bragging." And I go, "Oh no, that was not the intent. But yes, I get that. Yes, if you
Yeah.
don't," I go, "This is my job. The
Right.
problem is I'm not finishing them. I was trying to say I'm behind." So
Yeah. Yeah.
I will recommend. I think I recommended you Leon Cass's commentary on Exodus, and
Yes.
I've talked about loser letters, and I'm reading a couple others. Anyway, I'm going to give you the last word because we are out of time.
Yeah. Yeah.
So
Yeah. Yeah.
I will let you, if you want to defer to Emily, I will let you do that.
Okay. Well, just real quickly, she is living like we are, and she was self-consciously aware that she was living in a very turbulent time of great upheaval for a whole bunch of reasons that we've kind of hinted at or even said. And one of her more famous poems, a few lines here, it's not very long. "Those dying then knew where they went. They went to God's right hand. That hand is amputated now, and God cannot be found. The abdication of belief makes the behavior small. Better an ignis fought to us, which is a false fire, than no illumin at all." So she's basically saying we can no longer be confident about belief in God. We're left with two choices, basically abdicating belief, which makes behavior small. There's no ethics, or having a false fire, believing this stuff, and it's really fantasy land, but that's better than no fire at all or no lumen at all. So she's living at a real tension point. So anyway.
Well, that's great. Um, Thank you, David.
Thank you.
Thank you. You're working on a book now?
I am.
What's the book about?
Well, I've been working on it for many years, Mike. It's the book on where I use Habakkuk as my conversation partner to talk about how to trust God when inexplicable and or sudden trauma intersects your life. And so
Okay.
I know you've written on it and on that subject as well. So I'm kind of at the point where I finally need to wrap it up and kind of get it going. So I'm hoping to finish that this year. So that's the plan.
Well, yes, and I decided, since I was working on a book titled Broken when I had the stroke, that I was not gonna I'll pick a different topic if I'm gonna have to live it out. So I'll leave that. I'll leave Habakkuk to you, and we'll talk to you when that book is done. Thanks
Thank
so
you.
much for being with us.
Thanks, Mike. Great being with you.